Okay, so some of you have taken my class before, but basically I'm going to go over today some of the basics for this idea of site sizing a small, landscape onto this panel. There is, for those of you, I don't know how much experience you have with site size, but basically the idea is that you're flattening this image in your head a bit and copying the shapes. The thing about site size is it's very easy to get the proportions and the drawing very quickly. So for those of you who don't have experience, after I've painted, at the end of the demo you can come up and I'll show you how, standing in the same place, locking your head in, you'll see that all of the shapes here in nature are exactly the same size on the panel. Now, when I site size, it generally means that there's a lot of other artists who will do a lot more invention, move stuff around, take elements and change the sizes and everything. People who do comparative measurements, you basically have to do a ton of math in your head where you're measuring this and saying, okay, that compared to that is this big. And with site size, you can flick your eye back and forth the whole time and see shapes, angles, values, hues. It's a very good way of being fast and accurate, but it does mean that you often have to walk a little bit more to find exactly the composition you want. You don't, generally you can move stuff around as you get more advanced, but for the beginning, I would say if you want to use site size, to go out, and I'll often, looking for a spot, here I've sort of picked a spot where you're all in the shade, but when I'm looking for a spot, I will often, walk the last 10 to 20 feet over and over, getting exactly the composition I want. So some people see site size as sort of restrictive in the sense that you have to really walk a lot more to find your composition. I think I'll talk briefly about the materials. We were talking just now, I use this medium. It's a sun-thickened linseed oil mixed with Canada balsam. This comes from a recipe that was written in the 17th century by a doctor who studied with Anthony van Dyck. And it's, I like it because you can do a lot of different things with it. It's a great glazing medium at the end of the painting. It's a great laying in medium. As I start painting now, I'll show you some of the effects you can get with it. It's got a nice smell if you have to do commissions in somebody's house. And it's pretty reliable. I mean, Van Dyck's paintings are in good shape, and my paintings, I've used it for 20 years now and haven't had any cracking or anything. Right now, I was saying I use this lavender oil, spike oil, which I find kind of oily, and it's slow drying. I've seen people paint outside with like Gamsol or these odorless mineral spirits where the paint actually dries. If you're in the sun and the heat, it'll be dry before your session's over. For one thing, I don't like washing my brushes every day, so I like a slower drying medium. But also, I think a lot of the effects I like to get with painting, I like painting wet into wet. So I'm happier with a slower drying medium.
Did you say thickened linseed?
Sun-thickened linseed oil. So what they do is they put it on trays in the sun, but it's like stand oil is also the thickened linseed oil, but they thicken it without exposure to oxygen. Whereas the sun-thickened linseed oil, the air is allowed to pass under the glass so that it's actually partially oxidized already. So, and it thickens, like I say, in the sun. Originally, they would do it on lead trays, so it would absorb a bit of the lead, which is probably better. Apparently, the lead, there's a bit of concern now that everyone's switching to titanium white because there's an idea that the lead would sort of unify the drying time in the paint layers, so different colors wouldn't dry at different speeds. I use what's called a chromatic palette, and it's just the idea is that it's basically just the primary colors. So I'm using a titanium white instead of a lead white. It's a slower drying white. It covers really well. I use Williamsburg for a lot of my colors. I like it's stiff enough, has a high pigment to oil ratio. It's interesting, a lot of times artists will use, especially student artists will use student grade paints because they're cheaper. But if you know, when I go around, I'll take your brushes and paints and paint with them. And it's always kind of a nightmare for me, that dipping in, because I have absolutely no idea what your paints are going to do when I put it on a brush. I mean, when I try to mix a color. Whereas I know after years of using these exactly how much red I need to change a color. But I need, you know, these cadmiums I'll put out, you know, this will last me like 2 weeks. I'll go through the blues and the white and the ochre much quicker. And in fact, I carry this little bag of extra paint and I don't have any cadmiums in it because I know these aren't going to dry out, and I use so little. The tinting strength is so strong. What I was going to say about these student grade paints is they often put a lot of filler in them. So you end up, I'll need a lot, when I'm mixing with these student grade paints, I need to take a ton more color to change a color. So, you know, if I want to dull down a green, I'll need a lot more red. And so you end up using a lot more paint. So any savings you made on the original tube is lost when you end up having to use a lot more of it. Obviously it depends on how much you paint, but just something to think about. There are a lot of these colors we refer to as the warm and the cool. So we have the warm yellow and the cool yellow. This is a cad yellow medium, cad yellow light. Same with the reds. We have the cool red is the cad red medium. The warm red is the, it's also, you'll hear it referred to as a blue red and a yellow red, a blue yellow and a red yellow. The fact is that the thing about mixing with these is you don't ever really want to look at the value of the pigment. So say, for example, if you want to make a blue-green, you know, if you've got your back to the sun and you're looking at the grass there, the blue-green, you want to start, even if it's a dark green, you want to start with the blue-yellow. So you'll use the cooler, the cadmium yellow light, because it's much more difficult. You'll need a lot more blue to get a bluish green using the warm yellow. So you always want to look at think of the warm and the cool of each color. You know, ultramarine is considered the warm blue, the red blue. Cerulean is considered the green blue. And again, the same thing, if you know, often when you look just above the sky and you get the sort of haziness, it'll be sort of a warm blue gray. And even though it's the lightest, or, you know, one of the lightest parts in the sky, you're better off starting with the darkest blue because that's closer to the final color you want. You just add more white. So as you get higher up, the sky gets kind of green, and then you'll want to use the green, you know, blue, the cerulean. As you get even further up, it becomes more neutral, and then you can use the cobalt. So again, think of the hue of the color when you're mixing and not so much the value. When you get into really dark darks, obviously the ultramarine is going to be the darkest. Since we don't have any blacks on the palette, the ultramarine is how we get our darks. So I'm also using cadmium orange, and today I asked Leo for some purple because painting flowers is impossible without an actual, you can't mix a purple bright enough with blue and red.
Which purple?
I have no idea. Which purple are we using?
Cobalt violet.
Cobalt violet. Yeah, it's interesting because I have dry manganese violet underneath, which is darker.
At the end of the day, do you put anything on your palette to keep the paints from drying out for the next session?
No, only the blues dry out, and I go through them so quickly that it's not usually an issue. The cadmiums won't dry out for forever, and the white dries out very slowly. If I'm, you know, if I'm not going to be using this palette for a few days or a week or something, I'm almost always painting, so I'll often scrape the paint off and put it on I have a bigger palette for large paintings. I tend to just move the paint back and forth. I've tried putting them in these little vacuum bags that you use for food, and you suck the air out with a little $20 pump. Didn't really work though. And other people put them in the fridge. Actually, my wife puts everything in the fridge, in the freezer. When I get back to Italy, I'm going to buy a dedicated freezer for the studio just to put my palette and my brushes in. So Other people, I've heard of people putting them in an airtight bag with clove oil, which absorbs the oxygen and keeps the paint from drying out. So that's another idea.
Yeah, or I've seen somebody put a few drops of clove oil or some kind of oil and then a piece of Cerulean over it.
Yeah, so same idea. For brushes, I tend to use almost all, what are they called? Filberts. And then the occasional round. Just all of my bristles are from an English brush maker called Cornelison. They're in London. They last a long time. I really like the spring. In America, there's a company called Silver that makes a similar brush. They actually look, they have the same color too. And then I use a lot of these little sable filberts that come from Italy, from our local art store, Zecchi. And for detailed work, I tend to use a lot of these small sables. So that's the materials. I will just add that this is a palette I'm comfortable with. I've tried over the years adding colors to, yesterday we were looking at the painting, the American wing in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and they're all using, what was it, Prussian blue and burnt umber to make their blacks. And the paintings are gorgeous. So don't feel that this is, the end-all be-all in the palettes. This is just, I've tried over the years putting other colors on. My favorite painter, Isaac Levitan, I've stood in front of some of his paintings. You can see he was using some sort of transparent green, a Viridian or something, almost straight out of the tube. But I've tried putting Viridian on my palette, and then, every day I put it on, and every day I come home and I haven't dipped in. I'm not used to other colors. So this is the palette that I'm comfortable with. And
Can I interject something there, though? Something that is important, though, even though he's saying constraints. Marc uses an incredibly consistent palette, like putting out the same colors by the same brands, not switching from one color to another. It's the idea with a smaller palette, you should be able to anticipate how much of the color you need, how fast it dries. In other words, not switching to completely new palettes, but introducing maybe a new color
at a time, yeah. There's also, I've heard people say, oh, well, it's, 2018, we've got all these new colors, we should be trying them. I remember somebody was talking to me about shipping records into Venice in like the 16th century or 17th century, and they were shipping in all these crazy colors like, Badier brown and stuff. They were grinding up anything and trying to sell it to artists. And so for centuries, people have tried to sell artists the new, great color, and then it turns out after a decade or more, these colors weren't, the colors are fugitive, or they crack, they explode or something, and like bitumen. So I think what I like about these colors is the cadmiums have over a century of history. Apparently the cadmium yellows are starting to fade a bit in some of the impressionist work, but a lot of these are very stable, historic colors. Obviously, I think lead white would probably be even safer, but at least the ochre and the blue and the cadmiums, we have some idea what's going to happen to them.
Do you use this limited palette only in plein air, or would you also use it in the studio?
In the studio, my limited palette is much more limited. Like I just used the colors that the Greeks used, really, like black, vermilion, ochre, and lead white. So, and if you look, I think a lot of these historic artists too used very limited palettes. They were almost in competition to see who could use the least amount of colors. That was sort of a sign of skill and prowess.
Do you use the blue in the studio?
I mean, if I have to paint something blue, I will, but for the flesh palette, I don't use any blues.
What color black do you use?
Ivory black. So, some ideas on plein air painting. One thing that, a couple things when you're going out and looking for a view. Now, one of the main things, obviously, when we're outside is we have this, flaming ball of gas in the sky, which is making a lot more light than people are used to in the studio. Now, setting up around the sun, trying to figure out the best angle, the light. If you're looking towards the sun like this, it's interesting when I look at a lot of contemporary plein air painters, you see a lot of, or actually even historic painters, you'll see often artists clearly prefer either looking towards the sun or away from the sun. So you'll have, I don't know, like Corot's Italian landscapes are almost always looking towards the sun. If you look at Sorolla and a lot of his beach scenes, you know, he's often looking away from the sun with this golden light. Now, one thing about that is that a lot of times painters will look away from the sun in the early morning or in the evening when you have that kind of golden light on everything. Whereas when the sun is higher in the sky, a lot, certainly out west, like all the Western plein air painters, almost all of their paintings are looking towards the sun, the English as well, when the sun's high. Since today, you know, the sun is already quite high, I've picked a spot as a Californian plein air painter where I'm looking towards the sun as well. I think when you look towards the sun, it tends to be much more about shape and value. You don't really notice the hues nearly so much. So if we look at that tree line there, see how all the trees are different species and they're all different greens, but if you squint, throw your eyes out of focus, it basically looks like one, you know, it's almost the same green running straight across. If you turn around and look at the tree line above these white hay bales, plastic covered hay bales, you can see how, you know, one tree is a much lighter green, then you've got a darker green, you've got a brighter one, duller. You really notice the hues when you have the sun at your back. Whereas when you're looking towards the sun, it gets much more about value, shape. It's easier to make the design stand out more. The other thing about looking towards the sun is if you're painting, now it's cleared up, but when I was first setting up, it was partly cloudy. If you're painting on a partly cloudy day where the sun is coming and going, it's easier to paint looking towards the sun because basically most of what you're painting is in shadow, and as the clouds come over and it's still in shadow. So it's often easier for a number of reasons, for me anyways, to paint into the sun. Like I say though, it's clearly an artist's preference. I was talking to some other painters who said that the Gloucester School, like all of their paintings are high sun with the sun at the painter's back. You know, it's all about hue and every little nuance of hue. So I think a lot of learning to paint is learning what you're good at and what you like. I'm not saying you should shy away from things that are difficult and you shouldn't push yourself or experiment, but it is, like I'm doing a demo here, I'm going to be thinking about a lot of things. So I'm picking a backlit scene because I'm much more comfortable painting a backlit scene with a bunch of people watching me than a frontlit scene. The other thing is distance in painting. We were, looking at the sergeants yesterday. Apparently he would tell his students never to paint something that was further than 30 feet away or something. And when there's a sergeant of the Alps in the MFA where his distance, like you can tell he was just on autopilot and didn't care. Like he clearly is much more engaged with anything that's 30 feet away from him, and he said he didn't like painters getting lost in the distances, and his own distant work is much less convincing. Corot told his students never to paint anything closer than 30 feet, and he also produced beautiful landscapes. So Sargent produces all these wonderful landscapes of stuff that's close up, and Corot produces all these wonderful landscapes of stuff that's much further away. They're both great landscape painters, but they clearly had their own preference. So that's something to think about too. Do you like personally more close-up intimate scenes, or do you like the distances? Now again, don't shy away from things that put you out of your comfort zone, but it is something to consider. The next thing I was going to talk about is design. I think when I look at my own work, like I say, with the way I work with site size, I end up walking a lot more. I'll often do drawings too. I have lots of sketchbooks full of drawings where I do thumbnail, images. I'll do actual drawings of all the detail. And if I'm arriving somewhere new, I'll often go around and draw a whole bunch of compositions to give me ideas, and then I'll go back out and paint them. But the design of your subject matter, I think, is probably the most important thing in the painting. Next is values, and third would be color. I think a lot of people mistakenly think when you're outside painting that it's all about color because there's so much of it. But I think the most important thing to consider is design, then get your values right, and then have fun with the color. So I'll go briefly through some design ideas. Over the next 4 days, I'm going to talk a lot about rules in painting, and especially when I do the design stuff. When I talk about rules in painting, often when you go to a museum, you'll see a painting that really breaks the rules, and that's the one that will stick with you for a couple weeks. So don't feel like that these are set rules. These are just rules on how to make a successful landscape painting without, taking any risks. But then again, breaking them can make for a much more interesting painting. So I think I have a shelf in my studio just full of paintings that I never, posted online or showed to gallerists, or paintings that I consider failures. And when I look at them all, almost all of them have the same problem where the main design elements are all the same size. So you'll have a number of areas that are the same size. The example I often give, because it was such a, often when you're walking around and looking for these views, there's so much to think about that you might not get it all, you might see something that's very inspiring and set up not realizing that you've started into a design. That's why drawing is so useful. But the example I always give is I was in Amsterdam, and I only had 2 hours before I had to catch a train. So I went out, walked around the canals a bit, and I found this this view that I thought was very, typical of the city, where you had a church tower and the barge. And I mean, they're completely different elements, right? The tower here, and then the canal, and then the barge here. And what I hadn't realized was that I had painted the barge and the tower exactly the same size. And as soon as I'd been working for an hour and I didn't have time to do something else, and I suddenly just stepped back, realized it, and just Terps the painting off, because it wasn't. So that sort of, but it's not just that. I mean, you'll have another painting I went out and found, perfect foreground, middle ground, and distance, or say foreground, middle ground, and then a sky, and then you get home and you realize you basically just painted a flag, with the same amount of, you generally want to try to find, in a case like this, you want to have, more foreground, less distance, maybe more sky, but you want to try to look for things that, there's this idea in landscape painting that you're trying to get people to move into your painting, that their eyes travel into, you're faking a sense of space on the flat plane. An easy way to move people's eyes in is to look for large elements, in the foreground, smaller elements in the middle ground, and tiny elements in the distance. And immediately the eye moves back. Other ways of getting people to move in, obviously, are, the aerial perspective is the one thing that you have outside that you don't really have inside. The fact that the distant objects get lighter and bluer as they move away from us. But back to the design, so you want to try to keep elements leaving the corner of the canvas diagonally. You want to try to avoid having, something really interesting just on the edge of your canvas. You want to remember that you're going to lose about that much to the frame anyways. And you want to try to keep, a nice buffer zone. There's an idea too of moving the viewer's eye around the canvas. You can have, generally the composition, you're either going to have a steel yard, which is a large element on one side, counterbalanced by empty space, or you're going to have a bunch of objects sort of more central. I mean, there's lots of variations on those, but those are pretty much the two basic compositions you're going to be dealing with outside.
What kind of work is in a certain size range for most of it?
I mean, with site size, you're a bit restricted with,
How big?
yeah, with how big. So if you want to paint a very large view, you need a large canvas, or you have to paint with your nose up to the canvas like this, at least for putting your shapes in. So I tend to work you know, sometimes if you go to the Alps, or, you know, I paint a lot in Big Sur, and you're looking at these massive views, and it's impossible to fit them on a small canvas like this. So I'll often do drawings, or I'll just go out with a much larger canvas. Let's see.
Check that off. Who's one of your best?
So one more thing briefly is I have the panel in the shade, but I try to make sure there's enough sky reflecting onto it. This is, you know, when you take the painting inside, it's going to be hung eventually in a house or gallery or museum, and it's going to be in the shade. So you want to try to key towards what it's going to look like inside. So it's easier, I find, to have the panel in the shade with a fair amount of ambient light. If you end up, you know, if you paint tucked under a tree where, just say there's another tree here, and blocking all of this, you can end up with a really dark working surface. And then when you get back inside, everything will be keyed to light. So that's something I've seen happen. Also, I'm wearing like a dark hat because it won't reflect back on the canvas. If you have, you know, a bright pink hat and you're standing here in the sun, you're basically going to have a big pink area here, and you're going to key everything green. So that's something to consider as well. So often people ask about starting a painting. There's a lot of artists who start with the shadows first. I was always taught to start with the sky, to key the sky as well as you can, and then I key everything off of the sky. As I start to talk about values, I'll talk about compression of values, and I find that keying the sky first, for one thing, I found it nice when I was starting out, that if I always keyed the sky first, it was something I knew I could do. It was sort of made it much easier to get into the painting at the beginning. So that's another aspect to having a working method. Whereas when I was, you know, if you start with the shadows, you're always picking something completely different, perhaps something you've never painted before. I'll talk briefly too about actual paint handling. So at the beginning of the painting, I tend to use a lot of terps and medium. So here I've dipped into the medium and the terps, taken a bit of titanium and a bit of the cerulean. Often I paint in much drier climates where we have just a layer of kind of gray above the horizon because of all the debris in the air. Here it's rained recently, so you're basically going to have a very clean sky down to the horizon. But so I'm using a lot of medium and a lot of terps because it allows the paint to flow much faster. I can cover much quicker the sky. So I'm calculating my view here. Like I say, I've got these three objects in the painting. You generally want to look for odd numbers of objects. For some reason, it's more aesthetically pleasing. Apparently, this is true in a lot of design-related fields. I think somebody was a flower arranger taking one of my classes recently was saying it's the same in flower arrangement. So I've got these three little structures here.
So you have some thick and linseed oil, and what do you use? What's the other thing you use?
Lavender, the spike oil, lavender essence.
Not the balsam oil?
The balsam's part of the medium. Yeah. So for the design idea, you know, these purple flowers are quite subtle here. I often will draw a center line to try to figure out, you know, where I want to place everything. What I thought would be interesting to do here is I don't want this, you know, the little hut here in smack in the center. I thought I would put the flowers, the purple flowers, about in the center and then build everything off of that, so that the hut's going to be about here. Also, back to design briefly, there's a lot of structures here we're looking at. You want to try to, you know, if you imagine this little hut, instead of this triangular shape. Imagine it as a box. You never want to paint any structure so that you see the same amount on each side. So if you're painting a house, you know, you don't want to paint the house where you see the same amount on each side of the house. You want to move a bit so that, you know, you see much more of the front, or, you know, much more of the back. And the same with this little hutch here. You don't want to get set up so that you're seeing it where you see both sides the same amount. So I've tried to set up a bit where I'm further behind it. Now, I usually don't draw out everything on the canvas like I'm doing now, but if you're just starting out, you might find it easier to do to draw out your subject onto the canvas.
So I noticed you just like lay in sky color in one area and you don't worry about trying to cover the whole.
No, I will. I just kind of got distracted. So now I'll go back and cover the sky. And again, this idea, basically this idea of compression of values. So if you squint and look at that tree line, the dark and the light of the trees compared to the sky are actually really similar. And this is the idea of compression of values. If you look into the tree and look at the light, the sun hitting the tree next to the shadow, and you just focus on the shadow and light, you'll see a very strong contrast. But if you squint, look at the sky, and just think with your peripheral vision about the difference between the light and the dark of the tree, they're actually really, really close in value. So we try to exaggerate that a little bit. I'll make them even more close in value. A good way to actually handle compression of values while painting is to basically just use the same brush for everything. So, you know, I'll lay in, you know, this is basically kind of the color of the dark of the tree, but I'll lay it in everywhere. I'll take it a lot bluer. When you're looking for atmospheric perspective, always look at something black in your foreground. This is generally true trying to gauge values outside at all times. This backpack I had made, and it's gray, but it's kind of wish I had had a white one. I've also thought about making these this equipment, and I always thought if I did, I would have my logo be a little white and a dark square next to each other, just so that I can see them in the foreground and key the values in nature off of them. So it would be sort of a useful tool. I'll often look for like a paper towel, you know, that's white, right? So now look at the line above the horizon. You can see that it's much grayer, much darker than pure white. And the same goes with the trees here. If you look at the black in my backpack in the shadow areas, and then look at the trees back there in the shadow, you see how light and blue they are, you know, at this distance. So you always want to key off of, find something that's as black as you can find in the foreground and as white as you can find in the foreground, and look in the distance to key off of that. So again, for compressing the values and the hues, I'm basically just using the same brush and changing stuff ever so slightly. Now here, you know, I had laid this in with what looked like a very dark green, but now I've taken a darker green for the shadow area around it, and now that dark green has become my light green. And it's, you know, if I stare into it in nature, this looks much lighter than this, but if I look at the two compared to the sky, they're actually really close in value. So I'm using the same brush and I'm compressing the values where the light compared to the dark is actually much darker than I would see just looking at those two in relation to each other, because I'm looking at the two in relation to the sky. Okay? I think that's very important in painting in general, this idea of compression of values. Sorry, yeah, I was saying I would, so a lot of medium, a lot of terps. And then you're able to cover stuff very quickly. As far as mixing goes, generally the sky is going to be much more, the part we're actually going to see if we're painting a landscape is going to be basically this sort of cerulean, sometimes you get kind of a gray down on the, close to the horizon, but there's not a lot of the red or blue that you see. If you look straight up, it tends to get very red blue, whereas you're basically always going to be painting, I don't know, maybe 40 degrees off the horizon, and that's going to be about, cerulean and maybe a touch of cobalt at the top. I often paint all the way up to the sky just by adding more and more cerulean to get the darker blue. If you're looking towards the sun too, above the tree line, you see how light the sky is. It's very white just above the tree line. If you turn around and look at the tree line there, you see how it's a much, much darker blue. Obviously, we're seeing a lot more atmosphere painting into the sun.
Brushstrokes in some of your paintings in your sky, they're very vertical.
Yeah, I tend to try it. You can follow the actual rays of the sun, or I try to just have a broken sky. It comes from looking at Daubigny, French painter, this idea of keeping the sky sort of broken strokes, because it then kind of gives the feeling of the atmosphere. I have a gallerist who every time I send him a painting with the broken sky strokes, sends it back and asks me to polish the sky up. So it's a bit of personal taste too.
How do you keep your colors from bleeding together to
The titanium covers very well. So I'll get into that in a second, the way of keeping edges sharp. But basically, there's this, in painting, in studio painting, what do they call it? What's the term? I can't remember. Anyways, we were talking about it yesterday. Thick over thin, right? Fat over lean. In studio painting, it tends to mean, you put a thicker layer, or a layer with more oil over the layers with more solvent to keep them drying slower as they get out. But basically, when you're painting outside, a good rule is fat into lean. So as you're working and you need to cover an area, at the beginning, like I said, I use a lot of solvent and medium. But then as I move along, if I need to, say, go back and put in sky holes, I'll use just pure, I'll add less medium and less solvent to get, let's see, the little sky holes. You can basically just get one or two clean strokes before you have to grab more paint. But it's something to think about as you're working. I see a lot of students kind of struggling. As I put a stroke down, it's picking off the paint before. You basically want to constantly be adding more pigment to your brush strokes as you're working. So the beginning, a lot of oil, a lot of medium, and a lot of terps. And then at the end of the painting, you'll be using almost just pure paint to change shapes and stuff. Okay?
Let me interject something else there. This is like, I talked before about the terp jar. This is another pattern I'm sort of noticing with people that come to teach, is a lot of them talk a lot about the consistency they want their paint at to give them more control. So, you know, using more solvent initially and then more oil to be able to paint on top of it within the same session. And I think a lot of people, as they're learning to paint, try to paint everything with the same consistency of oils, which doesn't always give you the control to be able to do like the sky hole thing he's talking about.
Can I just also, if you are going back in and putting a sky hole in, if you're adding more oil to the paint, is that what you're saying? And that would provide more, like, more consistency, more, whatever, thickness.
You,
Or,
yeah. I mean, you'd add more pigment, not necessarily more oil.
okay,
So just pure paint.
just more paint, less.
Yeah, I mean, it's not actually a perfect analogy with fat over lean because fat over lean is often more oil. But this, you want to use more, I mean, kind of feels like you're going fat over lean because the pure paint is much thicker than paint mixed with medium. But basically, you want to just keep adding less medium and less terps. Like I say, at the beginning, I use a lot of terps. Then I'll use mainly medium and terps at the beginning. Then sort of just medium halfway through, especially when I want to get soft edges and stuff. And then at the very end, I'll just be using almost pure pigment.
I don't know a lot about the site size. I kind of understand horizontals lining up, I guess,
Mhm.
correctly to your canvas.
Yeah,
But I don't know how you control like vertical elements and where they fall in.
I mean, basically, if you got the horizontals, you can kind of do the math a bit. But the whole thing about site size is you can flick your eye back and forth. And if something is in the wrong place or too wide or too thin, it'll kind of jump in your, you know, in your mind's eye.
Okay, so it's not just about measuring then.
No, I mean, you can use it to, well, it's a bit about measuring everything, but so you can also use it to measure a value or hue. You can flick your eye back and forth and see if the value changes or the hue changes. If it jumps in your mind's eye, then it's wrong. When it's perfect, it won't jump. And obviously, you know, there's levels of perfection that we're working towards. You can definitely play with stuff and move stuff around, but this is, I'm basically giving you a tool for creating a view that looks like what everyone else is going to see in nature. So it's a good way to learn, you know, basically the craft of creating, you know, the same image that you see in nature. And then from there you can play with it and move stuff around, but it's a good way of learning. So again, this compression of values, I'm using the same brush for everything. And just changing the color slightly. Because if you look back there and key off the sky, you'll say, okay, well that area is a yellow-green and that area is a blue-green. But in fact, they're actually very similar in green, very similar greens. It's just that one is slightly more yellow and one is slightly more blue. But keyed off the sky, they're very similar. And the same down here, we have these much lighter bushes against the tree line. They're lighter, but they're not light if you compare to the sky. So I'm using, I'll go briefly through mixing greens for those of you who don't have a lot of experience. Right now, because it's these distant greens are very dull, sort of blue greens. I'm using the Ultramarine, also because they're quite dark, but I'm using the cooler of the yellows. So ultramarine and the cad yellow light, and then a bit of white to dull it. You can dull it with red too. Often, brief color theory is that you have your three primaries are blue, red, and yellow. Secondaries are the mixes of these. So the secondaries would be green, which is blue and yellow, orange, which is red and yellow, and purple, which is blue and red. And if you want to kill a red, you add a bit of the opposite, which is the other two. So if you want to dull down a red, you add a bit of green, which is blue and yellow. And the same goes the other way. If you want to dull down a green, you add a touch of red to it, and it'll just, the more red you add, the closer you'll get to gray. So the problem is that tends to make it a bit too warm, whereas in the distance we want to keep everything quite atmospheric. So I'm keeping a lot of blue and dulling down with white. Some more useful greens if you're painting these trees sort of front lit. One of my favorite greens, which is kind of surprising, is it's ochre and cerulean blue. And it basically gets you kind of the color of one of these mature trees in light. Like I say, these are just bases. You can then add a bit of a bit of cad yellow, a bit of red, a bit of white, depending on what you need. But so that, if you're painting front lit stuff, is a very useful green to have for these mature trees at a distance. It's actually quite close for this these little bushes down here. For the bright grass green, generally, if you're looking away from the sun, the grass green is going to go kind of it's much bluer. So looking that way, you would probably use the cerulean and the cool yellow, the cad yellow, and that's going to get you this sort of grass green seen front lit. If we're looking towards the sun, it tends to be much, because the light's coming through the grass, it tends to be a much warmer. So often for the very bright greens in the foregrounds, I'll use this cerulean and cad yellow medium. The last green, I don't tend to mix a lot with cobalt, but the last green is the ultramarine and actually, sorry, there's two more. Ultramarine and ochre, that gets you a very dull green. It's great for distant mountains. It's almost always the perfect color for distant mountains with a bit of haze. We use it a lot in Tuscany because of the olive trees. It's a very dull green. It's a great starting green for an olive tree. I don't really see a lot of it out here. And the last green is the one that I was using down in here, which is ultramarine and the cad yellow light. Ultramarine and cad yellow dark is going to get you the darkest color we can get, which is our black. So ultramarine, cad yellow medium, and a touch of the cad red basically gets you our black. And then you can take it slightly bluer or slightly redder, more. As things come forward as well, they tend to be much warmer. You're going to see a lot more warmth in the greens here, a lot more yellow, maybe a touch of red. Same with here. As things recede, you'll use less red and less yellow as things get farther back. So now I'm using a new brush for some of these distant areas, which is going to be our light green. And as we get closer, I'll add more yellow.
You're confused on whether something's warm or cool. Do you also have something to key it off of, like the paper towel thing?
Generally, if you're having trouble with warms and cools, it's almost always, the best way to do that is, actually it's interesting, when I was first starting out, we would never use the terms warm and cool, like my teacher would not, and I quickly began teaching with him, and he told us not to ever say warm and cool to the students. So he would have us say, oh, it's more red, it's more green, it's more blue, and I tend to do that outside. So especially if you're looking at grays, like this roof here in the sun is a very warm gray. Generally, I often say to the students, if you are ever struggling with a color, it's a warm gray, but it can occasionally be a cool gray. But so, if we take this, now I've just put that in, I can flick my eyes back and forth and say, okay, well maybe is it a bit, I wouldn't say it's a bit too warm or a bit too cool, but I'd say is it a bit too, maybe mine's a bit too orange, so then I'd add a touch of blue to it. I'll tend to, especially like I say with grays, it's most of the time you're going to be looking at grays and wondering if it's too warm or too cool. And it's better to think, is that too red? Is that too green? Is that too blue? Is that too yellow? I mean, the same a bit with these distant trees. If I flick my eye back and forth, this right now is slightly too, you could say this is too cool, but I can also look at it and say, okay, there's a bit too much blue in there. So then I'll add the opposite of blue. I think it's easier, rather than thinking is something too warm or too cool, to think, oh, is that too green? Is that too blue? Is that too red? Okay, does that make sense?
So what's the mix again that you're using on the field, on the light green? That's
The starting mix is the cad yellow light and cerulean blue. That gets you this very, very bright green. And as I get closer, I might switch to the cad yellow medium, because that gets you brighter still, much more yellow. And again, I'm gonna do a whole bunch of different greens in this sort of middle ground area. And I'm not taking any medium or terps. This is another thing about doing drawing in your painting. It's almost never, I'll never draw a shape perfectly with a brush, on the first go. So like this, the little, I'm not sure quite what it is, storage thing, it's a little chicken coop or something. I'll get kind of a general shape, but then I'll always use the color next to it to do my drawing. And I'm not using any medium or turpentine in here, so it's just pure pigment. And it's a much easier way to draw with the larger color on the outside than trying to, get these little lines. There's a tiny bit of a light coming up on the back side of this. So, I'll get the smallest line I can possibly get, but even then I can then take the color next to it and really kind of whittle it down and get the shape right. Okay? When you're drawing straight lines in general, I mean, it's not a lot out here, but you know, you often kind of do your best with the brush, but you're much better off trying to get the line straight with the two lines on each side of it. Also, for painting foliage, you know, rather than going in and painting every little leaf, it's often very effective just where you have the transition between one area and another to just show us the leaves there. So like, you know, rather than putting all the leaves down in here, if I just show us a bunch where we're crossing this dark area here, it'll look like all of this is the same thing. What brand of purple is this, Leo?
What do you say?
What brand is this?
Of Cobalt Violet? Gambling. It's the only one you can afford. It was like $300.
I ask because it's, I need a lot of it to, like I was saying, the affordable ones tend to have a lot more filler in them. Another thing about design, we have here a very, you know, the different ways of getting the eye to recede. I talked about, you know, large objects in the foreground, small. The atmospheric perspective, how everything gets bluer as it gets further back. The other thing is just to have one object cut in front of another object, right? If you have, you know, the little bushes here blocking the house, immediately pushes the house further back. Now, in the case of these flowers, they're very close to being what we call an unfortunate tangent, where one thing cuts just along the edge of another one. And in that sort of a case, you're better off pushing the flowers down so that they go behind the hut. Also, as I get over to here, the flowers, they go behind this large bush to the right here, and then they stop. That's not necessarily great design either. It's often, if you have something that changes dramatically behind something else, you know, it kind of goes in behind the bush and then on the other side changes. That's not great design. You're better off just carrying it over so that it looks like it's behind it. It gives us a sense of space. Does anyone have any questions?
In America, what boards do you use in your surface?
These are made by New Traditions. They're in Utah. It's Claessens, linen mounted. They use like a Beva film, which is what restorers use. So I like them because they never come unglued. Like I leave them often in the sun in the dash of the car, and they won't separate. Leo was saying, what's the tolerance of the glue?
140 something degrees.
Yeah, so they're basically made with heat, so then you have to hit the same amount of heat again to undo them.
It's not a water-based glue, it's a heat-activated glue. Actually, we did this in the class together, didn't
You were talking about there was a certain type of glue that you could use to mount canvas.
we? We actually did
easily.
it during the class with an iron. It might have been a day that you weren't there, but we brought out a household iron and we adhered and then took off a piece of linen.
So if Mark wants to, you can take the linen off the board.
I'm not sure if that's exactly
okay.
the same. The problem is you have to know.
Yeah.
You know?
Didn't Ben make these with him?
Ben knew him very early on, yeah. But I have 2 heat presses in my studio, so I can make nice things.
Anyways, I think they're great. They, you know, it's the same canvas I use in Italy, so for me it's nice just having the stability when I come here. I know how it's going to behave. And then, like I say, they're very lightweight for carrying. I take a lot back to Europe with me, and then when we have to fly again, I use them there.
You know what classman's number it is?
Yeah, you can pick which one you want. So this is C12. And then I think for the smaller boards, I have the 13.
What did you say called?
Which they're made by a company called New Traditions. The other thing about them is that my framer is in Florence, and he only works in centimeters. There's been rather disastrous cases where people didn't realize that and ordered, huge frames for a big unveiling of portraits and stuff, and then these little
20 by 30.
frames arrive. But so since I have, dozens of frames ready at all times, if I use these, the guy in Utah will make them for me, 2 centimeter sizes. So I can just pop them into frames. So now,
We call centimeter sizes metric.
metric and freedom units, right? So another good trick to learn is to measure angles with your brush, but you have to lock your elbow and lock your wrist, kind of lock your shoulder too. You measure the angle and then you bring it back and check it with your, but the trick is really to lock everything, because I see the students doing this all the time saying, yeah, it's perfect. But it's a good way of measuring angles. A quick little lesson in perspective when you're working outside is basically, especially if you're painting landscapes, a lot of times you're going to be painting stuff that's quite far away. And the rule is that anything at eye level is going to be, basically a straight line, parallel to the horizon. As stuff gets closer to you, the angles get steeper, the higher or lower it is above eye level. But a really good trick to remember is that basically almost everything is going to be close to a straight line at any kind of distance. Because I see people really trying to give angles to stuff that doesn't have angles. And anything that's really far away, basically is going to be a straight line. The same with tomorrow we'll be painting, or on Sunday we'll be painting water. Often the bend in a river is going to be a series of straight lines, maybe on that side of the river it's steeper, but I always see the students painting, basically what the river is doing and not what it actually looks like, which is going to be a number of straight lines, okay?
Uphill river.
Yeah, because it's true, there is a bend, and if you were above it, that's what it would look like. But visually, it's going to be a whole bunch of straight lines, and especially if you're painting something that's a river that's kind of in the distance, it's going to be a straight line parallel to the bottom of your canvas. So. I have boards. In Italy, we use these, they're boards that are made for tempera painting, and they're made with a gesso, which is, what is it, chalk, gypsum, and rabbit skin glue. And they're very absorbent. For oil painting, they're just a nightmare. And so we buy those and we seal them with a retouch varnish. And then because I'm already putting a retouch varnish on, I'll often put a little bit of a pigment in the retouch varnish just to give it a little bit of color, because they're bright white. Now this is kind of a nice bone color, so I don't mind. I quite like these, this little off-white. And I was originally trained just using white canvases, so I'm very happy with this. There's a risk with toned canvases that it might seep through at a later date. You know, oil paint becomes kind of transparent over very long periods of time. If you go to Palazzo Pitti, in Florence, there's one room where it's just all the paintings that were done on these red bowl grounds, and there's no midtones left because everything is just become transparent. It's just white and black. So I do paint on these orange grounds sometimes, and the color actually comes from, there was these Italian plein air painters called the Macchiaioli. They were sort of around the time of the Impressionists. They were also painting outside with broken color, and they would use cigar boxes. They were this very warm wood color. I think they were mahogany or something. And so their paintings show a lot of this orange wood coming through, and we sort of stole the idea from them, or pay them homage with these, by toning our panels to be a similar color and leaving a bit of, but I tend to only do it for paintings that are done on the sunny days. I like the way that you often have a blue sky, and it with the orange, I think it gives you a real sense of warmth.
What color do you use for it?
Transparent red oxide.
And you
Just a tiny a bit in the retouch varnish, and then I try to leave the paintings for the boards for a few months before I use them.
There's nobody in America that makes traditional rabbit skin glue gesso panels anymore. It literally, I have no idea why, and every time I teach one of those materials classes, I try to tell people a business idea that they can just take. But unfortunately, you can still get them at Zecchi, you can make them yourself, but for that particular type of surface, your only choice is to make it yourself now. And it is one of the most traditional, historic painting supports. I mean, the museum, a large percentage of what you're looking at is that surface.
Honestly, they're not that great. What's great about them is they're like $4 each or something.
Yours aren't that great.
I'm talking about the Zecchi ones.
I know.
Were you trained to paint on a white ground in Florence with Cecil or
Yeah, with Cecil.
Cecil?
Cecil.
Compared with the Florence Academy, he goes to like kind of a very light bone color for him, so that it doesn't do. He sort of passes over dark colors many times to get them rich. Whereas at Florence, they started with a darker canvas. Yeah.
And I really like that Baroque red bowl ground though. If it ain't Baroque, don't fix it. So another thing about design, this is very important, is you really want to have variety throughout your painting. So I was talking before about variety of large elements, but you also want to have a lot of variety in your smaller elements. You want to have a real sense of rhythm that follows the rhythms in nature. At the beginning, when you're starting out, I'll wait for the train to pass. So at the beginning, when you're starting out, you really want to just learn to slowly follow, exactly what nature's doing. You have a large tree here, this little pointy one here. Variety of edge also. So my whole tree line back here is razor sharp, which is something I get criticized a lot for. You can definitely soften areas. You want to have variety of edge, variety of hue, variety of value, variety of large shapes, small shapes. But at the beginning, for some reason this is more true for younger people, I've noticed too, younger painters. For some reason older painters tend to be much better at following the rhythms in nature. So in Italy we have a line of cypress trees, and people will often just go, okay, cypress tree, cypress tree, cypress tree, cypress tree, cypress. And our brain is basically trained to look for patterns and rhythms. We evolved outside in nature, and our brain, with lots of stuff that was trying to eat us, and our brain evolved in a way to filter out all this superfluous knowledge, like, is that cypress tree fatter than the one next to it or thinner? So it tends to just shut down. It'll look at a tree line and just see them all as trees exactly the same size, because you're supposed to be, paying attention to something else. When you're studying landscape painting, you have to try to undo all those millennia of evolution and really focus on the variety and the difference in each tree. Same thing with shadows. I mean, outside, we were probably evolved to look into shadows as we were being hunted by stuff. But now when we're out painting, we try to not look into the shadows, and to keep the shadows much more general and focus on the lights. The other one that I notice a lot students do is they'll, like on this tree line, they'll say, okay, this one is round, this one is, vertical, this one is flat, but they'll be able to follow the changing shapes, but all of the segments will end up being the same kind of distance. So, think of the line segment distance, think of the change in shape, think of the edge, and again, you can flick your eye back and forth to quickly measure this stuff.
You mentioned variety of value in the painting. Do you think about like proportions, like certain percentage is the darker value versus mid versus you try to?
No, I think that definitely depends on your subject. You'd want to change stuff all the time and not try to. When I was just painting for a show in Long Island, and I had a series of paintings, I would lay them all out, and then I would sort of look at it and say, okay, I've been painting a whole bunch of these sort of, flat lit beach scenes. So now let's go paint something, with a lot of dark in it. So I try to vary over a series of paintings the values as well. So, sometimes paint stuff that's close up and backlit, so everything's dark, and then other times I'll paint something where everything's far away and flat lit, so everything's quite light, and try to vary them on the whole. But I think it's hard not to paint a landscape outside and not have, your values vary, because obviously there's just a ton of different stuff going on.
It's more interesting to have a larger percentage be like have more of the darks take over more light rather than more even percentage.
You mean you don't want to balance? Yeah, perhaps. I think in this case we're gonna have.
More light because of what you're painting, right?
I was gonna say it'd be more dark because the sky is gonna be the only light area.
Yeah, I was really just looking at like the landscape area, like the lighter landscape in the foreground.
Yeah, well, again, I'm trying to have a large foreground. Here I've got kind of a smaller middle ground. Then the tree line, well, it's still sort of middle ground, but it's smaller still. So again, this is going to quickly push the viewer back into it. The fact that you have a large foreground, smaller middle ground, and then, a fair amount of sky. And again, there's this idea of starting with the darks and then painting the lights secondary. I tend to do whatever there's most of. So like up here in in the tree line, I'll start with the dark. Sorry, let me just have some water. In the tree line, I've started with the darks, and then I'll go in and add the lights. But on the foreground here, it's mostly light with a few accents of darks. So I'll start with the lights and then put the darks in afterwards. Another thing that we should talk about, especially with the weather we might be looking at the next couple of days, is this idea of painting into effects and out of effects. This is something that's very different from studio painting, where, and it can be frustrating for a lot of people outside. Basically, as we're working outside, you know, the sun is traveling east to west and everything is changing slowly. Now, since we'll be painting from 9 to 4, the sun's going to be pretty much in the sky, you know, pretty high up. I would say around, you know, the idea is that you do one painting from 9 to 12 and then another painting from 1 to 4. Because when the sun hits the zenith and starts heading down, it's going to change. Basically, you know, if you're painting something that's now in the sun, after 1 o'clock, it's going to be, your facade's going to be in shade. So generally, you don't want to be reinventing everything unless you have a ton of experience. So you are always painting sort of into or out of an effect. And by effect, I mean the effect you want for the final painting. So that, you know, if you're painting at dawn and you want a golden light painting of all the, you know, the golden light just as the sun comes up, you start probably before the sun comes up, you do your drawing, but you don't know what the effect is going to be. And then bam, the sun comes up, everything is golden, you see the effect you want, but as you're now painting, that effect's only going to last 15 minutes or, you know, half an hour. And then you're painting out of that effect slowly, and the effect is getting less and less. So in that case, you're painting out of the effect. If you're painting at sunset and you want the golden light, and you start at, you know, 6 o'clock in the evening or something, and sunset's at 8, you're going to be painting into the effect. And again, you only have the effect you want for 15 minutes. So the trick is that if you're painting out of an effect, you want to put down a lot of colors and mark the shadows, but then you do all the drawing using the colors from before. Now, painting into an effect, it's the opposite. You work on the drawing, building up to the effect, and then at the very end, you change your colors. It's just something to be aware of, that your effect is changing. Like I say, painting at midday, it's less, the effect changes much less. I mean, say the side of that barn there is north facing, right? Or more or less. A north facing object is going to stay in shadow the whole day. So, you know, the sun will be here at 10 o'clock in the morning, it'll be here at, you know, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and your light hasn't changed all that much. So there are certain subjects where you have your effect which will last 5 or 6 hours, and it makes it much easier. If you're painting at dawn or dusk, it can be really, a lot of times people will paint at dawn and dusk in the winters, or if you go to like Norway or Sweden or something where the sun just goes down, you know, to the horizon and starts coming back up. You get these very long, in Europe, and probably here too, in the winter, the sun goes down at 4 o'clock and it goes down at a long angle, so you'll get 40 minutes of golden light, whereas in the summer, it's just going to go straight down and you get, you know, 10 minutes of golden light. So these are things to think about, but as we're working the next few days, it's probably going to be partly cloudy. And when it's partly cloudy, you're basically constantly painting into or out of effects, because the effect you want is coming and going the whole time. And so good tricks to be aware of when you're painting and your effect isn't what you want it to be. For one thing, if a cloud passes over and you're doing a sunny painting, the shadows are basically always the same. So you can work on shadow areas. You can always work on your sky, because that doesn't change too much. And the other thing is you're out of the effect now, so you work on your drawing. and then you wait for the light to come back, but you don't try to rekey everything to the overcast light. Okay, so yeah, I'm actually going to fix a lot of the drawing because I've been concentrating on talking. Does anyone have any questions?
Are you working at about the pace you would normally work, or is this workshop?
This is real workshop pace. Also, I'm really inaccurate because I see these artists do demos like Stapleton. I have no idea how they do it because I find it really difficult to concentrate on the painting and talk to people at the same time. So my demos are always train wrecks because I'm much more concentrated on what I should be saying to you.
Do you try to limit your time? Like I noticed the light changes pretty drastically after like 2.5, 3 hours.
Yeah, I'll definitely not keep working on stuff. I mean, in this case, you know, the sun's now going to start coming over and these trees are going to get lit up. So I would put those in first. That's a good point. Generally, you want to take a moment to figure out, you know, if there's something in your view that might change dramatically. So if you like the way the light is on something, but there's a tree right next to it and you know the sun's going to pass and that's going to go in the shadow, you want to put that in first. I said to key the sky first, but if I'm painting a boat or a fisherman or something that I don't know how long it's going to be there for, or, you know, if there's a car I like, I'll put that in first because it'll go. I was teaching in Long Island and some of the students set up in front of with a parking lot between them and their subject. And I told them all to put their foreground in first because they were going to get an SUV guaranteed to park in one of those spaces and they wouldn't be able to see their foreground, so they all did the foreground first. And then it turned out there was a wedding and they brought like one of those limo SUVs and blocked the whole foreground parking sideways. So if you're set up over a parking lot, like you want to get your foreground in first. So there's definitely cases where, like in this case, the trees are going to get into light. If I want them backlit, I would put those in first.
Is there a reason you've left that one tree all the way to the left?
No, just because I'm not really... I mean, normally I'm much more methodical if I'm working. Also, to be honest, I try to slow down a bit for these demos because I noticed that if I speed through a painting really quickly, then the next 4 days you guys all try to speed through your paintings, and I want you to be slow and methodical, and it's something that if I go really quickly, then everyone goes really quickly. So that's a good point. If you're slow and precise at the beginning when you're starting to paint, and you can come back the next day, you know, we're doing 2 days here. Obviously you've lost the morning, but in the afternoon you can work on the same painting twice. Tomorrow as well, Sunday and Monday, you can do the same painting 2 days. And if you're slow and methodical and precise, then later on you'll get much faster. You know, if you very slowly and diligently copy, you know, the shapes of these trees and really pay attention to the rhythm and the change in segment and shape and angle, you'll get very quick at being that precise. But if you try to be fast, you won't get the precision later. Okay? So it's better to be slow and precise and then get fast later than to be fast now because you'll never get precise later. Okay?
Actually, a couple of you guys were in a course that we did with Marc maybe 4 years ago on the Charles River, and I think that was the first one where Marc and I were talking about this concept where typically demos are painted kind of at a breakneck pace to to make them interesting. And we were talking about just like paint it even maybe slower than you normally would, which sets up the pacing for the class. If you're rushing, then it also shows the group to always scramble. And that's kind of an interesting point.
Do you ever stand back with sight sizing, or do you always try to stay in that?
I mean, the point of sight sizing is my head has to be in the same spot. So I will definitely stand back and trying to gauge. It's a good point to take what we call an artistic pause. You know, check my phone. Normally I have a dog with me, I'll go walk the dog and then come back and it gives me a fresh eye. I see a lot of students who get really into their painting, and I think it can be detrimental at a certain point. Like, it's nice when they come out of the school because they've got this, the models take breaks every 20 minutes. So the students get in the habit of taking a break every 20 minutes. But I think it's definitely good to step back, like I say, you know, walk around, see what other people are doing, see the flowers, check Facebook, just take your eye off your painting for a minute. And then when you come back to it, you see stuff with a fresh eye.
So when you're sight sizing, you are kind of standing in the same place, keep your head in the same spot, and just kind of going back and forth.
Yeah, and if I move my head a little bit farther back, everything gets off. So if you really, I mean, I'm sort of, because I've been doing it a long time, there's a lot of it is sort of comparative. You know, I'm going off of stuff. But like yesterday I was doing these cityscapes and cars and stuff, and it's not something I paint a lot of, so I'm a bit out of my comfort zone on that. And I tend to be much more rigorous about locking my head in. Yesterday I was really struggling with getting the proportions right of, you know, cars in the foreground, cars in the distance, the buildings. It's just not something I don't paint a lot of that subject, or I haven't for a couple of years, so I was really rigorously using sight size yesterday. So.
I noticed I'm sorry to, when you first started doing that, you were kind of like holding the brushes like this on the side. Is that, I mean, you seem to know the size of the width of the canvas that automatically?
Yeah,
Or,
I mean,
okay.
basically, you know, it's probably not all that accurate, but I was just trying to calculate where I wanted, you know, my subject to go. And there's a guy named Joe McGurl he's from Massachusetts, lives out on Cape Cod, and he does sight size. Both of us sort of, because sight size is, well, I won't get into the how old it is, but it's been used at least this century for a lot of portraits and studio work, but there weren't a lot of people using it outside. And both Joe McGurl and I separately started working outside in sight size, and he's developed a frame that you can buy that actually clips onto your board that's standard sizes, so you can you know, sight size more rigorously. What's the guy's name?
Empty frame that's next to,
Yeah,
but
it's
then you better tape your feet down, I guess.
yeah. Well, it's easier to figure out if your head's in the right place,
Yeah,
'cause,
these really small, little adjustable ones.
but that's just for composition, no? For figuring out, yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, you sort of, but it's awkward. And
Yeah. Well, the beauty of his is I think it's at a slight angle, and it's exactly the same size.
The truth is, you could do a whole weekend workshop only talking about sight size, and if you have no experience with it, you might not even be entirely comfortable with it by the end of the weekend. But it is an interesting thing we can do. Consider. We do some stuff workshops.
So I see you have the camera on the tripod. How do you use that?
Which
The iPhone?
I was just filming to put online.
Okay. So I sometimes take a picture with my iPad of when I'm trying to figure out the design of the composition,
Mm-hmm.
and then I transfer it to black and white on the iPad, and then I cut and paste, you know, like change the size till I get a frame. And then I sketch it with charcoal onto the canvas, sort of the way you did with the paint. Just to then, and then I go sight size from there.
Yeah, I think whatever works for you. The only thing I would say is if you're starting with a photo, to always zoom in, because you do get a distortion from the lens
Okay.
if you're just taking a picture. Often the way to do it is to get further back and zoom in, because then the lens automatically removes the distortion. There's some programs too, like Lightroom, where if you tell it what camera you're using or what phone, it will remove the lens distortion for you.
Called
So-
Lightroom?
Yeah, it's Adobe's program. There's probably lots of them, but you can tell it, oh, this was shot with an iPhone. Push that little button, and then you can see it all kind of straighten up. So,
Thank you.
did I forget anything, Leo?
It's been wonderful, man.
Did I forget anything really important? So again, I'm just giving kind of a sense of the foliage by, I mass in a lot of it, but just where it covers something else, I'll put in the grass and the leaves, where it kind of cuts into the shadow area. Do we know where they set up the market tomorrow?
No, I don't. He hasn't talked about that with me at all, so I imagine it's small. It's supposed to be maybe a small farmer's market here tomorrow, and he's bringing fresh chickens right now. That's what he's going to do. This place is cool. It's like there really should not be a working farm this close to the city of Boston. The land's too valuable, but the town has always kept this farm here, and I think leases the land to the farmers that are. So it's nice. I mean, to find something this pastoral, we would need to drive at least twice this distance away from the city. Yeah, Allendale's nice. That's in Boston, sort of towards Jamaica Plain, JP.
A couple trustees of reservation places that I like one.
Yeah. But it's always been a nice location for a course because I'm so close to the studio here. If we were to get a rainy day or whatever, it's very easy to move indoors.
So Mark, obviously a bigger canvas, would be using bigger brushes in terms of stroke, scale, size, or...
Yeah, actually, they used to make fun of me in the studio because I would forget to get a bigger brush, and I would be working on a 7-foot canvas with these little ones.
What numbers are you using?
The largest brush I'm using today is a 4, so not very big.
Is that a 9 by 12?
Sort of. It's I think it's more 11 by 14. It's
25 by 35, no?
25 by 35 centimeters. God, I just had something I was going to say. I forgot. Oh, one other thing I wanted to talk about is changing light. And, I was saying that we're going to be painting in and out of effects. And a lot of people, especially studio painters, when I've taught before, when I taught at the Florence Academy, they would slam their easels shut and go home because the cloud came over, and they would get really frustrated. I've always seen that changing effects as an advantage. So if you see, if something changes and it was better before, you leave it in your painting. If it gets better, then you chase the effect, we call it, where you you know, basically if the light comes over the front of these trees and I think it's more interesting, then I'll change my painting to be, last night I was painting this sun setting in Waltham and the shadows are creeping across the road and then up the building, and I'm sort of trying to decide where I want the shadows, and also the light was coming and going, which actually was really annoying. But you try to see the changing effects as an advantage and pick the best effect that you want. And like I say, you can always come back another day and, you know. Also, hopefully we'll get these, yesterday we had the most gorgeous clouds, these wonderful puffy Atlantic cumulus clouds that we never get in Europe. I was just noticing my sky here is actually really boring, right? And in nature, there's this little kind of pink just above the sky. A good way to get the pink in the clouds is to start with, because the titanium tends to sort of cool stuff down pretty quickly, rather than starting with the yellow, because often these little clouds do have sort of a yellow hue to them. But I'll often start with an orange, because it keeps the warmth of the cloud, you know, maybe not quite central, but and again, compress the values in the sky as well. So I've talked about compressing the values underneath the horizon, but the same goes for above the horizon. You can look at you know, if you stare at that cloud next to the blue of the sky, especially the top of it, the cloud is much lighter than the blue behind it. But if you look at the contrast of the dark here and the light there, and then think about the contrast between the light of the sky and the light of the cloud, and they're almost exactly the same. So we would really compress those values, try to keep your skies, if you look under a dark cloud, it'll look really, really dark compared to the light above it or the sky behind it. But if you look for something dark in your foreground and then say, okay, how dark is that cloud compared to black, and you'll find that it's really, really light. So everything above the horizon compressed towards the light, everything below the horizon compressed towards dark.
You rework your sky a lot. Do you lose a lot of that broken color, or do you just kind of
No, I usually get more broken color the more I rework the sky, because I tend to I'll keep putting the sky in with a lot of these broken brush strokes.
So what color is in that where you're making the sky that warm color? Is that
So that was basically the sky blue, which I was using my sky brush. Like I was saying, an easy way to compress the values is no, I take it back, I used this one. I think this is my sky brush from yesterday. An easy way to compress values is to just use the same brush for everything. So in this case, if I wanted to, I was saying to use, even though it's kind of a yellow above the horizon, I was going to start with the cadmium orange, but I'm basically just using the same sky blue that I've used for everything, added a bit of white and cad orange to it, and then, you know, probably a bit more white to really take it lighter. And then that kind of gives you this sort of warm salmon color.
I think probably something you guys can see him doing continually is when he's doing an area, fill it in relatively flat with the sky, just a couple bands of simple color, and then more variation goes into it after the value is correct. Large color field, simplified, and then variation, and then more vibration.
Also, for those of you, I mean, the Florence Academy student, when you go to these ateliers, they teach you this outline, shadow line, shadow. You know, you learn to do a cast by drawing the outline, then you draw the shadow line, and then you fill it in. It's funny because I always think of the Karate Kid where he does the like wax on, wax off, and you know, then he suddenly realizes he's learned how to fight. The same thing with this outline, shadow line, shadow line. Out here, even though that seems so tedious in cast drawing, that's basically what I'm doing here. I'll often draw, you know, my shape is the outline. I'll put in the shadow line, and then I'll fill it in. And so you basically end up just doing what you were doing in cast drawing, but you know, the whole time you're working outside.
So you're like drawing the shape of the shadow, in other words?
Yeah, and then I fill it in.
Outline, shadow line, cast line, was it?
No, outline, shadow line, shadow. Don't they teach you that? What's Jordan teaching over
Not
there?
that. Not that phrase.
Yeah. Is that Cecil?
You know, it is funny that this is another common thread of workshop instructors that come and teach in my studio also. Basically everybody references studying from the past as one of the greatest things that helps them in their professional work. It's not something you'll ever see is, you know, people aren't proud of their past paintings. It's not a central part of what they do. Some people put them on their websites. But it's an exercise that helps you to work accurately from their shapes quickly.
So again, as now that a lot of this is covered, every time I'm making changes, like I say, I'm chasing the effects a bit here, putting in some of the light coming down, giving a bit more color to those trees, because like I was saying, as the sun comes around, these are going to become less atmospheric, and you're going to start to see more of the hue in the tree. And again, you can decide which you prefer. But I'm really slowly and methodically copying the shapes of this tree line.
How would you handle like a real hairy tree? Like there's one way over to the left over there. Like that. Would you put in all those kind of...
Sky holes, I mean, you probably wouldn't put them all in. Another thing about sky holes is that a lot of artists will do them slightly darker than the sky. So if the sky is, you know, this light, and this is a darker kind of a blue, gray, and then you put these, let's see, kind of slightly darker blue in so that it doesn't jump so much, so you don't have such a strong contrast. But yeah, I would start with, I mean, to paint that tree there, I would start with kind of the general shape of the tree on the outside, and then using a slightly darker sky, I would, and again, there's no, it's just white and just pigment in this, because then it's easy to cover. Kind of figure out my shapes by using the negative shape. Everything that's not tree.
And you would be faithful to it, not
Yeah.
distract from...
I mean, like I say, I'm using a slightly darker blue than what's above it. And I wouldn't put in all the sky holes because it tends to get too fussy. But I would put in a few to show that it's a different shape. And also, you want to, you know, find a couple of the trunks and then really follow them up. So if you have, you know, say one here, and again, variety. Often with sky holes, you'll see students doing, okay, sky hole, sky hole, sky hole, sky hole, sky hole. You know, and they're all the same size and the same distance from one to another. So you really want to slow down and follow the rhythms. But, you know, say the trunk is here, then you want to find the same trunk again higher up. You know, and that kind of gives you the sense of the structure of the tree. And I'll often go back and forth with the green and with the blue, and whittle my shapes down. Like right now there's 1, 2, 3, 4 right here in the middle that are all exactly the same size. So we can try to kind of make some of these larger, maybe make one of them smaller. I often, like I say, our brains really like switching to autopilot and just going, sky hole, tree. And so even with me, if I get distracted, I'm thinking about what I have to pick up on the way home or something, I'll switch to autopilot too. But I just remember to stop, take a step back, and then say, okay, are these really in such a line? Is this such a square? Are these all exactly the same size? Is this shape and this shape, like I've done there, exactly the same size? Actually, no, this one, let's see, we have the large one and this one here, and then this is actually two, smaller ones. So that's sort of looking for those rhythms in nature is really important. And like I say, it may be slow at the beginning, but you will get faster at it. A lot of it's just really learning how to concentrate. And like I say, turn off this this part of your brain that is just seeing everything as patterns and repetition, and really see what is actually there in nature.
To that end, as the light comes forward, you can see one is a deciduous tree and one is an evergreen tree. Would you paint the different rhythm of the shapes?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think right now mine is, I have this line going straight across like that, but there is definitely it's a lot more interesting, as this one comes around. I've actually changed a lot of it. As this comes around, it actually drops quite a lot. Some big sky holes in here. There's, like I was saying before, distance with atmospheric perspective. So like, I don't necessarily have it, but you can see over on the right there, you can see through the trees, but if I put those in, they're right here on the edge, which isn't good design. You don't want the eye going out of the painting over there. But I could definitely bring in sort of, it's a bit too blue, but some of these kind of a bit more distant, somewhere in the middle to give a sense of the atmosphere. And again, titanium white is fantastic for drawing the shapes of trees. The fact that it covers so wonderfully. So yeah, like there I just did outline, filled it in. Now I'll do kind of the shadow line and fill it in. So a lot of what you learn in this cast painting drawing will be used later. And again, just the sort of edge of your one shape to the next, you can really give a sense of what's there. Like it looks like there's a little line of these white flowers. Also, I'm painting without my glasses. For those of you, I'm astigmatic, so I see everything kind of blurry. People tell me they like the way I simplify, but this is actually just how I see. So it's very helpful if you have kind of blurry vision to paint without your glasses on. You don't get caught up with all the detail. Yeah, I mean, this is about the level of information I want in the painting, and this is what I see when I paint. So You know, if you go to Venice and you see the late Titians in the Accademia, it's basically the beginning of Impressionism. He got old, he couldn't see well, and he just kept painting these very blurry paintings, and they're wonderful, and that's, you know, what Velázquez saw, and Manet saw Velázquez, and that's art history, was a bunch of people who can't see. So variety of edge. Also, a lot of times if you stare at an edge in nature, you can always find a sharp edge, but you want to really look for, you know, especially the edge of a cast shadow will be a wonderfully soft edge. Often you know, you'll have areas in shadows where you can't really see where one thing ends and the other. So that's what I was saying before, don't look too much into shadows. Keep the shadows much more general. Another thing I haven't really talked about looking this way is reflected light is incredibly useful. You know, if you look at the road here, you see how dark the shadow is under the tree. You get a lot of reflected light at the base of the tree trunk, and then as you go up it gets darker and warmer because there's, you know, you're getting less of the actual sky bouncing back into the tree. And then as it crosses the road in the middle there, it's going to get quite blue because of the light coming down from the sky above it. And then it goes back into the dark green. That sort of effect it's a very useful way of capturing the sense of the ambient light, the blue sky. If you look at the shadow there, you see how as it gets farther away from the tree, it gets bluer, where the light is reflecting down from the sky into that. Underneath the tree here, you got a lot of reflected light, so it's going to be lighter because of the light reflecting off the road. That's another thing that's different than a lot of studio painting, is you have much stronger effects of both the ambient light coming down off the blue sky and very strong reflected light off of, you know, sometimes off of colored subjects like that. You know, the red here, as the sun moves around, you're going to get a really bright red reflecting onto the white building next to it. So I really like my acid greens. Other people hate them, so kind of a taste issue. You can decide what you want to do. So again, you don't want interesting shapes or elements taking your eyes out of the painting. You want to try to keep the viewer looking around inside the painting. And you know, large shapes that are then repeated the same kind of element further back. So here, you know, we've got a very large kind of shadow area. We've got a medium one here, and then some small ones, you know, much smaller still going back. And that very quickly gets a sense of distance into the painting. As they recede, adding more white and more blue. It's also a great way of getting a sense of distance. Variety of chroma here with the brighter greens and the duller greens. And I'm using the same brush for these large areas just because it's I'm trying to keep everything quite compressed. So even for the lights and the darks, I've been using the same brush. Well, actually a bit of this for the shadow, but
So for a painting like this, at the end of it, how many brushes will you end up using?
well, I mean, it's kind of all green here. I would say for a painting this size, I maybe use 12 brushes. Basically, my working method is that I'll use the same sort of handful of brushes every day. But almost everything I'm painting is going to be shades of gray, in the sense that if the green has a touch of red in it, it's fine. It's, you know, it doesn't need to be pure green. There's very few areas where I need a pure, clean color that's really, really high chroma and clean. Like, say, these flowers, the only way I can get them to pop out with Leo's cheap purple is just the cleanest possible. It has to be a new brush, white, and pure pigment, and even then it's not going to be bright enough. To get it to really pop, but after a couple brush strokes it's going to get muddy, so then I might grab another one. I think I've used 3 brushes so far on just those purple flowers, because as they get muddy I need a new one. Now in theory I could stop and clean it off with Terps, but this is my working method where I'll keep reaching for a clean brush when I need a very, very clean color. But for the most part I can get away with, like I said, I was using a lot of these brushes yesterday for a cityscape at sunset, which looked absolutely nothing like that. But, you know, a lot of the time the colors are going to be kind of muddy, so it's okay to have a bunch of muddy brushes that you're using, and you change the color with the mud in it. And then when you need the pure color, the clean color, you use a clean brush, and after a week of doing that, all of my brushes will be dirty, and then I'll wash them and start again. Okay? So that's sort of the work.
Interject something there. The only reason why it works for Mark is he's mixing each color on the palette. He's not mixing like on the canvas. Really.
No, I do mix on the canvas. I take that back.
Making little pools of paint where you
Yeah, but I love mixing on the canvas.
paint into stuff.
Yes, I paint into stuff, but. So yeah, like I was saying about chasing effects though, as we get these little puffy clouds coming out, I definitely think it's going to be more interesting, you know. Here's an example of I would probably need to get a clean brush now, because this has a bit too much mud in it, and to get the really the bright kind of peachy gray that's up at the top, I'm just going to need to use way too much pigment to fight this color.
And no matter how much you try to wipe that out, it's never going to come as clear as you want it.
Yeah, I think it's just that I don't want any green in it, and there's a touch of green in this. So I think I could get away with a gray, but by the time I would need so much white to get rid of the little bit of green in this that it's not worth it.
When you're keying your painting and you're looking at relationships, and you're looking at the relationship through your peripheral vision, like you look in the sky
Yeah.
and peripherally you look at the relationship between the trees
I mean, your end goal is the painting, right?
Yeah.
So I think the more important thing is the way they relate in the painting, the compression of values. That's what you're asking?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's important that they relate to each other in the painting, both to each other and to the sky. Because basically what you're seeing out there, you can't actually get the full value range with pigment and oil. You know, it's actually, you know, especially when you start looking at, you know, the sun reflecting off something, it's much more bright than you can reproduce with pigment. So we're kind of faking it to begin with. That's actually a good point too, is like if you're painting, let's see, I don't really have an example here, but say this, the barn here, you know, when you get up against the sky and you squint, if you key against the sky, it's going to be really, really dark. But then when you get down to the bottom of the barn, you suddenly have the shadow cast, and it's actually the cast shadow on the grass is much darker than the barn. So the way we would do that, because you can't get the full value range with oil paint, is you would actually fake it. You would make the line against the sky especially much darker, and then you would sort of gradate. You know, often if you have a white building that goes up to the sky, it'll be more, you know, here there's actually local color and it has the sun on it, so it's not a great example. But the side of the barn there, or the side of the house there, where you have white meeting the sky, you'll go much darker up there, and then you'll actually fake a gradient. And by the time you get to the bottom, you know, the actual color you're putting down has much more white in it, even though you're seeing one color that is the same from top to bottom, but you're faking to make it darker against the sky and lighter against the grass. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. And one thing again about this medium that I like, and if any of you don't have it and you want to try it, I can give you quite a lot of it. But there's, if you paint into it like I'm doing now, it'll kind of fuse the edges on its own. So it'll keep the stuff, if I've used a lot of medium and then I paint into it with more medium, it'll kind of soften the edges.
What makes it a slow drying medium? Is it the Canada balsam, or when you get some like sun thickened linseed oil, does that make it faster drying?
I mean, sun thickened linseed oil should be slightly faster drying since it's oxidized already. Hmm? No, I think the medium, what is it? Yeah, I mean, I'm using lavender oil, so that makes it slower too. It's mixed with turpentine. You actually cut the Canada balsam with turpentine before you mix it with the linseed oil, so there's quite a bit of turpentine in it, which is, I mean, slower drying than some other things. But yeah, I guess the Canada balsam dries slow.
It's a relatively fast drying medium, but by diluting it doesn't start drying until all the solvent in it evaporates.
Yeah, I guess depends on what you mean by slow drying.
Some
It'd
people
still be
call
drying,
Marc's medium very
fast drying.
But the spiked lavender oil is the slowest evaporating of all the solvents, so it stays slippery for a long time. That's why it's called oily. So once all that's evaporated, it starts to tack up. But while there's still some solvent on the surface, it feels wet. Yes,
Yeah, it's like
resin.
honey.
So like sap out of a tree.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
You have to use turpentine to cut it?
Or
Is that
spike
just the
lavender
recipe?
Or
oil.
a spike oil.
It won't cut with mineral spirit.
Do you buy your medium like in a jar, or do you make it?
I have half the year I'll make it, half the year I'll buy it. It depends on whether or not somebody is making it conveniently. In America, I often get it from a guy from Blue Ridge Oil Colors in North Carolina. He sells it pre-made. And in Italy, our local arts.
Still in business?
His studio, or his factory, burned down, but he rebuilt it.
Come back.
Yeah. So I wrote to him 2 weeks ago, trying to get some while I was here, and then realized that I had bought a ton from him last year and I hadn't finished it, so I actually canceled my order. So he has some now because he makes it himself and he thickens the oil himself, so he doesn't always have it.
Do you ever use Cobalt dryer?
No. I realize when I'm saying fast drying, this is fast drying slow drying compared to what a lot of plein air painters use, which is like Alclid and Gamsol. So there are other painters who use clove oil so that it stays wet for 6 months or something. So I find this to be the perfect speed of drying in the sense that it'll stay wet the whole time I'm out and maybe into the next day, but 3 days or 4 days later or a week later it's dry to the touch, and then I can, if I have to leave it with a gallerist or something.
Does it dry as much with the sort of oil sucked out look that you get after painting with Gamsol?
Well, it definitely stays,
A little oilier?
more. It still could probably use a varnish, and it depends also what surface you're using. I mean, the Classens is pretty, you can get like double primed and triple primed, which will sink in even less. So,
Are you just using the single prime?
I don't know, what's the 13? Do you know?
It's hard to keep track of. They keep switching the numbers too. 66 reappeared in America after 10 years and you couldn't find it.
They have a 166, which is acrylic prime.
No, this is 66. It's a double prime that we used to use in Italy,
Oh,
and it hasn't been in America for all the years. it's been
66 is what we use, and for us, it's a single primed medium texture.
here.
And I was having trouble with it because I get these small holes in my painting when you hold it up to the light because there isn't actually enough priming on it if I don't tone the canvas.
Yeah, you can always put another coat of priming on yourself, but
That's what I should have done.
about sinking in, the Canada Balsam and some thickened oil does help because it's a polymerized oil and a resin, it does help the colors to stay saturated. Yeah, if you're after sort of jewel-like effects, polymerized oils, whether they are some thickened or stand oil, a bodied oil, and a touch of resin does help.
So what's your ratio for the medium? Is it half and half?
Yeah. But Sunthick and the Canada Balsam is cut half and half with turpentine or spike oil before you add it to the Sunthick. So technically it's 2-1-1.
The Canada Balsam is what you buy directly from this Bluegreen.
Kramer has it.
No, Canada Balsam, Blue Ridge will sell the whole medium ready to use. He calls it the Demerin medium, which is the doctor who wrote the recipe down. Now the recipe that he wrote down was actually something called Strasbourg turpentine, because obviously Canada didn't exist. Strasbourg turpentine, he describes it in the manuscript as being like a straw colored, and we can't get a straw colored Strasbourg turpentine anymore. It's from a European fir tree that they don't, there's not enough demand for it, so nobody produces it. So Canada Balsam has some crazy properties where it is used by physicists working with optics. There's something really special about it that they can't reproduce synthetically, so there's a market for it for scientists, and because they're already producing it in very high grade, somebody figured out they could sell it to artists as a substitute for. You also might have heard of Venetian turpentine or Strasbourg turpentine. These things are, like I say, the Strasbourg turpentine we find now, it's very brown,
Yeah, I have
and
some,
it
it's like chocolate.
cracks. Yeah, and you can see when you open it, it like cracks. There was a year or so when Kramer found a source for a straw-colored Strasbourg turpentine, and the smell of that was just gorgeous. But sometimes with Venice turpentine, occasionally with this medium, but hasn't happened to me for a long time, you'll get beading, which is really, really annoying, where you have a dry surface, you're trying to paint over it, and nothing will stick. The paint, you do a brush stroke and it just reduces into a whole bunch of little dots. It's incredibly frustrating. And that happened much more with Strasbourg turpentine than with Canada Balsam. I was looking at these, the Levitans in Plios, and there was he was having the same problem. Like you could see his brushstrokes had become little beads. So I don't know what he was using, but and actually we were looking at some of Sargent's yesterday. You can see he was having issues with beading and stuff, yeah. So,
Beading can happen just with linseed oil too. It's an annoying thing.
apparently the solution is to rub it with a potato, right? Have you heard that before?
I always use
The starch kills it.
Potato?
Potato.
Yeah, I always use a cuttlefish bone to open up the surface.
In photography, when you clean lenses, you get this streaking from the water, and the way around that was to add a little bit of detergent. So I wonder if, like the Dr. Bronner's peppermint soap, if you were to put a strip of that in with the solvent, that would stop that foam and not have an effect, a negative effect.
Okay. Any other questions? For those of you who don't have a lot of experience with site size, if you want to come stand here, and it's easier to see what I'm talking about if you put yourself in this position. Ignore my drawing errors because I was concentrating on talking.